So my name is Alejandro Roark, and I'm the Executive Director for Hispanic Technology and Telecommunications Partnership. HTTP is a CEO roundtable of 16 of the country's oldest and largest Latino civil rights organizations who work in coalition to promote access, adoption, and the full utilization of technology and telecommunications resources by the Latino community across the United States. Through our community engagement, congressional education, and by serving as a national voice for Latinos in tech and telecom policy, HTTP member organizations work to support the social, political, and economic advancement of Americans of Latino descent by facilitating access to high-quality education, economic opportunity, and effective healthcare through the use of technology tools and resources. In our increasingly complex and interconnected world, innovations in technology and data are bringing us closer to a reality dominated by automation, prediction, personalization, surveillance, and the merging of our physical and digital selves. This shift is also taking place at the same time that our country is experiencing transformative cultural, demographic, economic, and political shifts. As new tools are developed, unintended consequences tend to emerge and oftentimes impact those most vulnerable in our society, and specifically communities of colors. This precise paradox exists when we consider technologies like facial recognition, a tool that was developed to improve our lives by creating more efficient systems and greater personalization has now led to real and severe harms to Black and Brown communities. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Nicole Turner Lee, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution, to our kitchen table conversations on race, technology, and the future of everything as a part of this year's Digital Inclusion Summit. Nicole, thank you so much for joining us today. And
Thank you for having me. And I love your opening remarks. I think you nailed it perfectly in terms of what we're dealing with today.
Thank you so much for taking the time. And I think that as we begin this conversation, I kind of want to just flag that it's clear that facial recognition systems are not created equal. Different algorithms perform differently, but we currently have minimal oversight, regulations, or safeguards to ensure that facial recognition tools are achieving a tangible public good. And so I wonder if for those of us that are joining today that may not be as tuned into this conversation, would you share with us what you think is at stake for communities of color and what we should all know about facial recognition and its potential harms?
Yeah, no, and if you don't mind, Alejandro, I'm just going to tell people who I am, because there's some people in this world who just don't know, as well as sometimes myself when I wake up. As it was mentioned, I'm Nicole Turner Lee. I'm Senior Fellow in Governance Studies and the Director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. And in that portfolio, I work on a variety of issues from digital inclusion. I have a book coming out next year on the U.S. digital divide that includes a focus on some Latino communities, as well as artificial intelligence. And my particular focus there is how do we create technologies that do not necessarily amplify or exacerbate the existing discriminations that we have. And it's important that we as communities of color really pay attention to this, because technology is pretty much transforming how we live, learn, and earn. I want to say one more thing about this great organization that I have watched evolve, and under this great leader is doing absolutely fantastic things. We need Latina communities to be represented in these conversations. It's really easy for people to think that communities of color have a variety of other issues they're dealing with. And they're right. Voting is one of them as we lead up to a national election. But one thing this pandemic has actually really exerted is that we have a lot at stake if we're not connected. The first line of my book is being connected matters in 2020. And I can tell you something else. It mattered before the pandemic and it's going to matter right after. So I want to make sure that people understand the context for why it's so important to have these conversations that HTTP is having, because of who is going to have it if it's not us. So Alejandro, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for putting up with me as I actually have been exhausted these last 7 months dealing with the digital divide. I mean, when we look at issues of facial recognition technology, I think it's really important, and we at Brookings are doing a project around this, particularly trying to lay out principles for law enforcement use of facial rec tools. I mean, we want technology to be a problem solver, right? We want technology to be used in ways that actually garner the types of efficiencies that we've not been able to achieve through human cognition. Facial recognition came out of that. I mean, what best to sort of detect and determine the identity of people but through their face? But there are challenges with that technology. I mean, on the one side, facial recognition is absolutely fantastic when we're looking for older Americans who are missing, children who are estranged or exploited. The face detection allows us to age them using computer models to, in some cases, find them, because they're actually used by public safety officials in ways that are for the public good. But, and one other thing I want to mention, when the Boston Marathon bomber, for example, we used facial recognition technology to identify him in a crowd where we were able to identify the type of espionage that he placed upon that activity. But where facial recognition actually has some challenges is its technical accuracy. So if you know me really well and you follow me, you would know one thing about Nicole Turner Lee is that I like to change my hair. So, sometimes it's braided, sometimes it's straight like today, sometimes it's curly and natural. I don't wear many wigs, but you might on occasion find that I might be wearing one. The bottom line is we know that facial recognition does not do a good job with identifying Black women who change their hair. And the fundamental cause of that is that facial recognition does a poor job in identifying people of different skin tones. So the darker you are in complexion, the less likely the facial recognition will be accurate in really determining who you are. And there are implications of that. The implication is not that someone will mistake me for Janet Jackson or beloved Selena. The implication is that someone may actually misidentify me as a criminal. The Congressional Black Caucus just a couple of years ago had facial recognition technologies applied to their entire populace. And out of that, a good portion of them came back as potential criminal defendants, meaning that their faces were sort of equated as mugshots to other similar faces in their system. So on the technical accuracy side, we really have a long way to go to get it right. And part of the reason we've not been able to get Black and Latina faces right on facial recognition is not because we're just so darn beautiful. It is actually related to the fact that we don't have enough people working in those fields that can contribute input towards these diverse and inclusive models. In addition to that, we don't have enough people like myself, who's a sociologist doing technology, that can talk about the sociological implications of finding out that someone that you've actually detained is really innocent. If you think about the disproportionate representation of Blacks and Latinas in the criminal justice system, and you think about the use by law enforcement of this new and shiny object to identify us for criminal cases, the likelihood is that the data that will actually pull upon will be people who are previously incarcerated, which will most likely be us, and it will overlay the technical inaccuracy, which will most likely make it wrong. And so I think, Alejandro, we have to pay attention to these things, particularly if it gets into the hands of the wrong actors. Technology in and of itself is flawed. It's flawed because the very design of it takes into account the external world in which it's deployed. And right now, as you've mentioned, we're dealing with a host of racial inequality challenges, a host of challenges that have been brought on by this administration. And all of that feeds into technologies that by themselves do not discriminate, but rather the people who design it may have unconscious bias that feeds into it, as well as the context in which it's deployed. So facial recognition for criminal justice use may also be inherently flawed just because structurally it's never favored Black and brown people.
And so you bring up a couple of really interesting themes that I think we're talking about as a part of this year's summit, right? The idea that we need increased representation, that it's Black and brown communities. We shouldn't just be consumers of tech, but we should be building tech, And I feel that, Black and brown and historically kind of marginalized communities or historically kind of underheard communities really have the key to unlocking the potential to our future, right? An inclusive future that serves everyone. And so I think that, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into kind of like facial recognition and its use for law enforcement, because as we saw in the wake of social unrest in response to the George Floyd, whose death was broadcast live around the world, millions of Americans took to the streets in protest against brutality and state-sanctioned targeted acts of violence. And at the same time, we also saw law enforcement officials deploy sophisticated surveillance tools that included wireless interception, license plate scan, and facial recognition, which, within that context kind of has the potential to encroach on our constitutionally protected right to protest anonymously and without fear of government retribution. So it's clear that facial recognition tech has its pitfalls, But luckily, I think that we've seen municipal governments ban this type of technology specifically for law enforcement purposes. And we have even seen developers of this technology, like Microsoft, committing to not selling their facial recognition software to police, and that they would not sell their products until until Congress passes federal legislation to regulate this technology. So I guess my question to you, Nicole, would be, are these outright bans on facial recognition the only answer to mitigating their harm? Or what specific things can we do to ensure that we are developing and deploying responsible tech? And what questions should we be asking of Congress and our elected officials?
Yeah, I like what you're talking about this. Honestly, I would say that outright bans are not necessarily the immediate route that we should be taking, and I'll tell you why. Policymaking has not caught up to innovation, and we have to be really careful about, putting restrictions on certain types of technologies without fully exploring the type of research that I'm talking about, going deeper on what makes a technology flawed, but then also employing, best practices around the use cases. How does it look when it's deployed, like I said, among seniors who are missing versus among potential criminal defendants? How does facial recognition and other emerging technologies actually serve to create unintended consequences? And a lot of what I'm doing at Brookings is really ensuring that this next set of technologies do not discriminate or cause disparate impact or treatment of particular groups of color like myself. You look at historically, I'll give you just a perfect example of why outright bans, are important. I think what we did after George Floyd's murder was actually important, where companies like Microsoft and IBM and Amazon and others basically said, stop. We've got to really figure this out. And part of the reason they did that was because that technology was used for protest surveillance. And that's challenging, particularly among communities where activism and resistance are pretty much baked into our blood. But I want to give, before I jump into that, just kind of go back to this thought. In England, for example, face detection or image detection was used for the real estate market. And at the time, it was actually assumed that people's blocks could actually be captured via video image so that it could be used to sort of look at the production of the community or how the community evolves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They put an outright ban in that. And then when technology picked up and we have now all of these real estate engines that are helping, sellers sell their homes, it's kind of hard to reverse that, right, in the UK, particularly now with some of their regulatory regimes where they're actually, putting in much more tighter privacy restrictions as well as antitrust restrictions. I say that to say in a marketplace that is now driven primarily by digital, we have to also just be careful that we're not putting the pause button or the stop button on technologies that we need to learn a little bit more about. And I can talk more about that later, but I really feel that when I talk to policymakers and I talk to engineers, we have a problem in terms of language, right? We don't have an interdisciplinary approach to policy. We sort of have the inputs and the output conversation, and we don't really understand the middle, which is at the work I'm doing at Brookings, and particularly the work we're doing around facial recognition with my colleague, Rayshawn Ray, who has done a lot of work on policing, and Rebecca Wexler, who's been doing a lot of work on forensic technology. What we're trying to figure out is, well, what are the best tools for law enforcement in terms of deployment of facial recognition? What kind of training do they need, and where should they not apply it, right? And where's the digital due justice that comes into play in terms of the retention of faces? How long can you keep a face? Should a face be collected when you're under 18? That kind of stuff. So we hope to be putting that project. And I'll be in touch with HTTP because we want to hear from our civil rights stakeholders around their thoughts on this as well. But generally, I think it's important that we do have some guardrails in those use cases that will have a very detrimental impact on communities of color. So let me just explain to people why that's most important when you start looking at AI and other technologies. We always start out, and people call it the black box. I don't know why they call it black, so I'm just going to call it the box, right? The box starts with inputs and outputs. The inputs are the questions that you have around the use of a technology, what you think the technology will actually remedy or solve or mitigate. And it comes with a basis of criteria. So what do you think is the question, and how does that question sort of look if you add in various criteria? The unfortunate thing in the technology space, to one extent, when we come to sensitive use cases, is that exact data about people's background is not necessarily collected. So what happens is they infer. So they may infer by our purchases, where we live, the language that we speak, that we may be a person of color. So that's sort of the input. It's this very blurred, ambiguous world that I call that mathematicians describe as discrete. But when it gets into the box, It's like a snake at the bottom of the ocean, right? It starts as a model, but then it adapts. And that's why algorithms are really interesting. It adapts to the experiences that we have within the context in which it's deployed. So criminal justice algorithms act themselves out the way that we as a society have treated Black and brown people in the criminal justice system. So if we're overrepresented in mugshots, facial recognition goes to those mugshots first, which then are likely to render a person of color as the potential defendant or the potential aggressor. That then defines what comes out of the black box, which is the outcome. And that's where policymakers like myself and yourself get concerned. Because now all of a sudden, technology, which is meant to be a lower barrier to entry, which is meant to increase efficiencies, which potentially should be more fair, now over-criminalizes Black and brown people because they're highly represented in the data in the box, but they're also assumed to be criminals in the society in which we live. Given that, I think we have to have a lot more conversation then on what side of the box are we trying to regulate. Are we trying to put regulation on having companies and developers explain to us what's going into their models? Is it more of the interpretation of those models under different contexts? Or is it the fact that these models do not contribute positive outcomes to an already flawed criminal justice system? Now, many of my engineers friends would say, but Nicole, the efficiencies that are created through computers actually takes off of the bench the ability to have to make these kind of decisions when the data is pretty clear that this person will not be a recidivist. But people fail to understand that even if you have an improved 10% accuracy, you still have 10% less of the people who are already over-criminalized and incarcerated still being over-criminalized and incarcerated, if you get what I mean. So you're not really solving the problem, which is why I tell engineers the most important thing is we need to be really clear about why we're using the technology in the first place. So when you look at what happened with the protests and Black Lives Matter activists were out there, we saw a couple of technologies being deployed that were very problematic. Facial recognition used for protest surveillance, faces captured like we're in the Hoover era of blacklisting certain members that were out there protesting, having files on them, I'm sure. And then we also saw the geofencing of protests in terms of keeping them contained through drone surveillance technologies that essentially watch their movement and their flow. So when we hear this president, for example, say, these are not lawful, peaceful protests, that's obviously because they're being surveilled. They're being surveilled in person, but there are also tools that are being used to sort of heat map where this activity is happening. That is extremely problematic on the civil and human liberties of people of color. We have litigated far too long to allow and permit our levels of resistance as part of American democracy. And they should not be used in ways that curtail our freedom of speech, as well as our ability to sort of make noise when we feel that there's an injustice. There's also problematic, and we've seen this also, Alejandro, apply in immigration circumstances, where these same technologies are being used to sort of reinforce racist and discriminatory immigration policies, where the same type of facial recognition makes a prediction as to whether or not somebody should be in this country. These, again, if you go back to my analogy of the box, these are all subjective assumptions about populations that go in. They act out in a certain context that may not be known to the scientist who sits in a lab, and they have outcomes in terms of our behavior. If I'm law enforcement, I say, oh, I got him, right? And this happened in Detroit, Michigan. They picked up an African-American guy, detained him for like 6 or 7 hours, and they found out he didn't do nothing, simply because his face matched someone else's face. That returns back to what I said in a very long-winded way, the technical inefficiencies that continue to be glaringly and selfishly sort of flawing these systems where they discriminate against people of color. And that's problematic, right? Because unless we have guardrails on certain use cases, which I'm a huge fan of, so ban, not so much versus appropriate legislative and regulatory guardrails in certain use cases, I think then we begin to apply it where we can have the balance of the good of technology and really curtail some of the potential harms.
There is a lot to unpack there, which is why I invited you there. You know, there's a lot of kind of like overlapping and intersecting themes that I think we really all kind of have to be aware of. You know, I love this idea that you kind of introduced, which is this idea of a digital due justice for facial recognition, right? And I think that when I consider facial recognition, part of the problem is that, you know, these technologies are being sold to and deployed by law enforcement agencies with minimal or zero, community input. That's from our leaders. That's from private citizens. We really have no idea who developed the technology, what types of data sets they're using, where the data that they're collecting ends up, right? Are they going to sell it to or compile it and sell it to another vendor, another municipality, right? And I think that, in our increasingly kind of like digital age, we're seeing that, this kind of like repository of Black and brown faces are really having detrimental impacts, not just in the criminal justice system, but everything from, mortgages, right? Everything from like, right now, if you want to apply for a visa, right? They sift through all of your social media. They do a search for, what is kind of like your digital footprint online. And then they're using that information to determine your worthiness to be a citizen, the type of interest that you get on a mortgage loan. And these are all kind of compounding and snowballing in a way that none of us had a very clear input on, right? I think that what I appreciate about the moment about George Floyd is that giving technology companies the benefit of the doubt, right? They either had no idea that their technology like produced harm to Black and brown, people, or, they knew and said, what, now that we actually know, now that we had this kind of like galvanizing event across our country, we really have to be more thoughtful about the way that we deploy this technology and who we're deploying it to, right?
Yeah. I think you're completely right. Now, I don't want to get on record in your event saying that, platform companies are like, when you just said, do they know about their malfeasance? I almost had this image of the man in the lab, like, yeah, we're going to, create the tuxedo experiment, and we're going to disease Black men when they take a vaccination. I want to say that part of what's happening in technology evolution is that we have seen technology sort of go from a conversation around the haves and have-nots, so I can get a little bit into my book, right? We've had the digital divide around for a very long time before COVID, which was actually defined as a binary construct. Who had access, who didn't have access, who had a device, who didn't have a device. We've seen technology evolve into content, where, the very first AOL, and I'm not going to age myself, but the AOL web browser and Mozilla and other web browsers really were the first to come onto the scene to direct us to the space of the internet, which, by the way, was made free because of the reciprocity that we as consumers give up to maintain an ad-supported model for these platforms. You move forward, and now we see technology is tethered to your ability to have financial collateral. You cannot get an Uber if you don't have a credit card, or Airbnb without any type of financial collateral. It's kind of in my book. I kind of lay out where we've gone. When we talk about rural electrification, oftentimes we talk about broadband as utility. What people don't understand is we're beyond electrification, right? We're at this space where technology has actually impacted the new technology, not just surveillance, but voting, right? In terms of misinformation and disinformation. So how do you unpack all that, right? And how do you actually sift through what I think you're talking about, the unintended consequences? Like, who knows when those consequences exist? First and foremost, I think you cannot recognize that you're going to have unintended consequences if you have homogenous work environments. Without women of color, men of color, Latinas, African Americans, Native populations, Asian Americans who sit at the table of products and services, not just the diversity person, but products and services who can make decisions around, and these are true stories, right? Like using European faces to train people on how to look like a movie star is only going to lighten the complexion of browner skinned folks, slim their jawline because it's trained against European faces. I mean, this actually happened. All those things that we do online, and we're like, oh, look, girl, look how beautiful I look. Well, you look like a beautiful Black white woman, right? Because the data was trained off of a European face. And when you go back and you read the open articles around why developers did that, they would tell you they just didn't know. And so I think what you're talking about is this age of permissionless innovation is now being met by permissionless forgiveness that now goes into the realm of people being denied mortgages or credit or employment. I mean, as a sociologist, we always knew that your name, so if I was Nicole Johnson or Nicole, Bouvier or something like that, it might suggest where I'm from, my race, my ethnicity, my language, right? Nicole Rodriguez. That is why we've always had blind interviews, right? And we've had blind reviews of credit applications. But as you've mentioned, The computer actually has inferences about us. It connects the dots in terms of our realities without even gathering a question on what's your ethnicity, your race, or your preferred language. And so given that, you have to think about then what are the implications? I mean, I want to say first and foremost, I've been advocating on my side at Brookings that we actually explicitly apply the civil rights laws to the digital space. They are not waived. It's no exception. What is illegal is illegal. If there is an algorithm that denies people the right to access credit or employment or housing, we saw that with HUD, there should be some weight placed to that algorithm's ability to actually break the law by excluding versus including people. So that's the first and foremost thing. I've been really active on that the last couple of years, trying to get some member of Congress just to outright say that these laws should be directly applicable to tech companies in terms of their development of products and services. Secondly, in terms of workforce diversity, we don't have an equity dashboard that tells us who's being hired at these companies, who sits in the development and the products and services department, who's actually doing the audits and the check. I think companies are competing for our eyeballs. I think they should do that as best practice. And I'm developing a model right now around an algorithmic Energy Star rating that allows us as consumers to let these companies know when their algorithm is performing in a way where I can open my phone because it can see my face, right? Or if it's not going to see my face because I change my hair, just let me know so I don't buy that product, right? So part of it is having that conversation as well. But I think you hit it when it comes to employing, this responsible AI. What is the extent to which we want AI to be diversity by design, inclusive and representative? And to what extent do we want to ensure that in particular use cases, it goes through a due diligence and exact scrutiny that will ensure that there will not be the extent of unintended consequence? And I think that in and of itself sounds beautiful. I know because I said it, right? But I'm gonna tell you what's hard about that. Most policymakers are not data scientists. Most data scientists are not sociologists. And when you add that together, you have a direct mismatch between what the policy should dictate and who's at the table. And so I think until we sort of figure out how to bridge what is important on that box, is it the input or the output? Is it the determination? Is it the disclosure? Is it the explainability? Is it the audit? I think we're going to keep having these conversations. And the unfortunate thing is, this last thing, over the last 7 months, we've given the computer so much data, from our COVID status, to the movies we like, to the shopping that we do, to the type of tomatoes that we buy. And as a consequence, there will be more deception, and there will be some more frayed, interaction that we will have with technology, simply because it has predicted our behaviors in ways that it can actually be used against us. People who have COVID, and that's known, may not be offered lower rates on their insurance, may be denied insurance. In some cases, people are being denied in some states because COVID is now a pre-existing condition. So I just put that out there because we as people of color have been deeply impacted by this pandemic, and these will have implications going forward.
So Nicole, we're about kind of out of time today, but I just have one final question for you.
Not that much, I'm sorry.
I have one kind of closing question for you, and that is, when and where can we purchase your book? Is it out already? Can we pre-order? I feel like I want to be the first on that reading list.
You better, because if you're not, I know where to find you. And I'm coming to your house, to that beautiful kitchen. And in return, you're going to make me something to eat. Because I feel like I need to be at your house having coffee with you. For those who are interested in what I said, and in all seriousness, you do enough of these, and I know you watch enough of these, you got to make sure that great people like Alejandro have this space to talk about this. And I'm so glad that you invited me to speak about this, because this is so important. You can find me on Twitter at Dr. Turner Lee, and my book, and you can find me at the Brookings website as well, under my expert page. And my book will be out next year. I'm really excited. It'll be out around second quarter. It actually involves a qualitative interviews that I did across the country with 7 communities. Would love to share just a real quick soundbite for the Latino community. One school that I visited was a school in Maricopa County, which you all are familiar with, was a major place where they did a lot of deportations illegally. But this particular school, every child had a cell phone. Every Latino child had a cell phone. And I tell in my book this very poignant story. They had a cell phone because that was the only way to communicate with family members in case, something went down with law enforcement or they couldn't come home. And I share in that book sort of what we talked about today. Where are the promises of technology? But the book is entitled Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. And I really share also in that book is that the new underclass are not people of color, but they're farmers, they're families. And if you look at what's going on with this pandemic, they're people who just never in their lifetime thought that they would have to be connected in order to survive. So I'm really looking forward to the book. It's my first book. Done a lot of white papers, did a dissertation, but there's nothing like writing a book during the pandemic when your topic is just so busy. So I'm hoping that the next few weeks will just allow me some downtime to really think about how to properly tell the story of Black and Brown people within that book and within anything that I do. So thank you. I so appreciate you, and support HTTP. You got to. And it's not HTTPS, it's HTTP. For people.
Right. So thank you again, Nicole, for a great conversation. And to everyone who's tuning in from home, please make sure to follow at Dr. Turner Lee on Twitter and Brookings on Twitter. And please also, I'll make sure to link their information in the description below. And please also make sure to follow HTTP on our social channels at HTTP Policy to be the first to hear about our upcoming conversations presented as a part of this year's Digital Inclusion Summit. Until then, tune into the conversation, speak out, and stay connected because the future needs our help. Until next time, have a good one.